become clear as to why I'm showing it as we progress today. Now, it does have a little piece of music, so you might hear the music or you might not, but I wouldn't be too worried about that. I'll provide a commentary since the music's not playing. This is the site of the Came of Isbister in the North Mainland of Shetland, and it's a very isolated stack site that is almost impossible to get onto. I know this from personal experience, having found it almost impossible to get onto. You can't get on from the land side anymore, although apparently you could up till the 1930s, when a landslip meant that the path, and that very narrow path, totally disappeared. But you can make it from the seaside if you swim round, or if you get in a boat and jump off at the right point. And that's the way that I managed to get onto the Came of Isbister. Now you may ask, why on earth would I want to get onto this particular site? Well, as you can see, on the seaward side there's a grassy slope, and you can just make out an embankment there, and up towards the top of the slope you see a slightly different colour of green and sort of hummocky grass rather, and that is a series of structures, buildings. There's about 19 buildings on the Came of Isbister, and they're all sort of rectangular in form. They're sort of squeezed together on the top of the hill, and you can't see them from the landward side, but you can see them from the sea. And the reason for showing this today is because Raymond Lamb, who did his PhD thesis on promontory sites around the coast of Britain, was very interested in some of the sites that he identified, which weren't Iron Age, which he believed were in fact eremitical monasteries from the Celtic Church. And this was one of the ones that he identified as such. And we're going to look at eremitical monasteries and the sort of the diaspora, if you like, of Celtic clerics soon. So this might be one of the very sites that members of the Celtic Church sought out as deserts in the ocean for their monasteries. You can just make out the structures now a little bit better on the top. So my movie's about to come to an end. It gives you an idea of the inaccessibility of this particular place. And there are a series of these sites around the coast of Shetland. In fact, there's one directly opposite on the other side of the Elsund. So if you like, you can imagine that this was a site with clerics who were living a kind of eremitical hermit type life, although they were living together, of course, but they were choosing to live separate from everyone else in that particular site. I'm not actually convinced myself that it is such an eremitical monastery, but if you read Raymond Lamb, then you get his opinion that they are. So it fits into what we're going to talk about. Okay. Anyone got a question about that before we launch?
Hello Andrew, can you hear me?
I certainly can.
Can you just repeat that guy's name again? Was it Raymond Lamb with a B on the end?
Lamb with a B. There are two scholarly Lambs that have written about the Northern Isles. There's Gregor Lamb, who's written about, he's written about the church in the pre-Viking age in Orkney, and also written about place names in Orkney, Norse place names. And there's Raymond Lamb, who was an archaeologist and explored some very difficult to get to sites around the coast. And it's Raymond Lamb who's the one who came up with this idea that they were eremitical monasteries from the pre-Viking era, part of a thalassocracy, if you like, a sort of a seagoing monastic set of people who went out and lived in the most inaccessible places in the North Atlantic. And that's been the generally accepted view of sites like the Cave of Isbister. But I'm not too sure that's exactly what they are. But still, you'll find it in the literature that that's what people have believed. Okay. Right, so that's just to start us off with a movie. Okay. Slideshow. That's what we want. Okay, so I'm wanting to take you back to the Atlantic before the Vikings set out on their expeditions. And I want to cover, I suppose, 4 different aspects of this subject. So I want to give you a simplified overview of the development of 2 cultural traditions. The one in the west that ultimately became the Celtic one, and the one in the north that became the Nordic cultural tradition. So that involves doing an enormous span of history in a very short period of time. So I'll take you back to the Ice Age. So go from the Ice Age to the Viking Age today. We'll look at the development, the peopling of these areas and the development of these 2 cultural traditions. Then we'll look to see, well, one of the things that become apparent is that these 2 cultural traditions are quite distinct. They may have been come from the same root originally, but they became very culturally distinct. And I want to see if there's any evidence for contact between these 2 areas in the pre-Viking period. There is some evidence for this, but it's quite difficult evidence, so I want to pull it apart and tease it. And then I also want to look at evidence for movement across the Atlantic. So there's sort of movement between the Celtic area and the North area, and also movement from the Celtic area out from the sort of the homeland of the British Isles and Ireland into the west and the north. To sort of prove the point that of this seminar, in fact, that the pre-Viking Atlantic was Celtic. I think Iceland is, oh, they're back, there we go, that's good. If you get cut off and you're on Jabber, don't fret. If things freeze, just literally come off and dial in again. So things happen with Jabber. It's not the greatest system, unfortunately. So as I say, I want to take us right back to the very beginning and then skate quickly forward in time. So let's start at the very beginning of the population, the arrival of the population into an area that we're going to focus on through the course of this module. And first of all, let's look at Orkney. Recently, the very first evidence has turned up of early Mesolithic, or in fact late Paleolithic, occupation in Orkney, and presumably in Shetland and the north of Scotland too, really quite soon after the last ice age. And the culture is identified as Ahrensbergian. You might think, why would I bother with this? Well, the point will become apparent soon. It turns out that this culture, the Ahrensbergian early Mesolithic culture, was shared with the north of Germany, and was also the first hunter Stone Age culture to make its way into Norway as well, when the ice started to retreat after the end of the last ice age. So, in actual fact, the very first population set to settle in the Northern Isles, and the very first population to settle in Norway after the last ice age were the same people, in fact. They belonged to the same cultural tradition. And the specialists in the Mesolithic period have suggested that the Ahrensberg culture of North Germany and Denmark was also common, also settled in the area called Doggerland, which is the sunken piece of land that is now under the North Sea. Doggerland has been mapped, and the extension of it and how it gradually disappeared over the millennia until it finally disappeared about 6000 BC, has been properly studied. And it looks as if the Arensberg culture, they were hunting reindeer in what's now the North Sea. And some members of this culture came across to the north of Scotland, and others went to Norway. And recently, using genetic research, it's been suggested that the Sami might be the direct descendants, in fact, of the Arensberg reindeer culture. There's debate about that, of course. The Sami also include, there's also evidence from more eastern in part of their genetic heritage, but it's quite a nice idea to think, before we get into the separation and the distinctiveness between the Atlantic and the Nordic areas. In fact, they may have started with the same population, the same culture. But the distinction between these two areas really, it happened very early. For example, the Neolithic Revolution reached Scotland and Ireland at least 1500 years before it reached the west coast of Norway. And this is when we start to see that sort of divergence, if you like, in the cultural traditions between the two areas. I'm talking in very broad terms here, and I say skating across the top, but I think the general picture is clear to see. The Neolithic started more quickly in the British Isles and Ireland, and it veered off in a different direction from Norway. The Caitcha Fields, for example, here in County Mayo, that's an extensive farming landscape that's been uncovered under the peat of Mayo, which dates back to at least 3500 BC. So there was a sort of extensive farmed landscape at that point on this particular part of Western Ireland. And we know that from the extensive work that's been carried out in Orkney, that Orkney was a great centre of Neolithic culture, and producing extraordinary buildings as far back as 3500 BC as well. So this is the new structures that have been dug up at the Nessa Brogga in Orkney, beside the stone circle. There's a massive... Yeah, sorry. Hello, Timothy.
A quick question, sorry. Do we have any idea what they were farming?
Well, yes, it's called the sort of the Neolithic farming kit. I mean, there was wheat and barley, and they also had the domestic animals, cattle, sheep, and pigs. So it was a kind of, I suppose that's what you call it, sort of a Neolithic farming. Kit's the best word. And you find it all over where the Neolithic revolution took place. But it was quite primitive, and they also, the type of barley was beer, E-E-R-E, and the wheat was quite primitive form of wheat as well. So it's at the very beginning of the agricultural revolution.
I come from a farming background, that's why I asked.
I see, yeah. That's good. That's the first question. That's broken the ice. Excellent. Just following on the western side, this early Neolithic culture developed, as you can see, to produce quite extraordinary structures in the West. And it's a sort of shared culture that it's been noted that there must have been cultural connections from Orkney via Ireland all the way down to Portugal and including Brittany as well. There was a sort of shared cultural heritage. And just to show that, I've got two of the biggest of the Neolithic chambered tombs, Maeshowe and the Brugh na Boine, the tomb on the Boyne. From about the same, there's about maybe 500 years in difference between them, but they're massive megalithic structures, and the art is, as you can see, the same. Whatever these swirls meant in Orkney, they must have meant the same thing in Ireland, because the same motifs are turning up. But again, we're not getting into this in any great depth. It's just to show that there's a an area with cultural connections being established in the West. And since I'm in Shetland, I have to mention that, of course. Shetland's always been a little bit out on a limb, and still is, but the Neolithic revolution reached Shetland too, and it reached it from the British Isles. So there were farmers in Shetland from around 3000 BC as well, and Shetland at that point was the most, the furthest that the Neolithic culture reached. It was the real edge of the world, and that, it sort of being the extreme of human settlement in northwestern Europe, remained the case throughout the Neolithic, Bronze and Iron Ages, and the early medieval period too. It's only with the establishment, the arrival of the Vikings, that you get settlement further away and further to the west, really, than Shetland, with one or two exceptions that we'll come to. In fact, we're going to talk about Thule, and there's good evidence that the Romans applied the term Thule to Shetland, but we'll see it was applied to places further away at an earlier period. We'll come back to that just in a second. Okay, so I don't want to make too big a thing of this, just to show that by 1200 BC or thereabouts, in the Bronze Age, the British Isles and our Celtic areas that we're going to be talking about in the other seminars belong to what's identified as the Atlantic tradition, and the Scandinavian countries belong to the Nordic tradition. Their networks, if you like, of interaction are within these sets rather than between sets. So you find cultural connections and similarities all the way from the north of Scotland down to Portugal that are different from the cultural connections and identifying aspects in the Nordic tradition. So this has been going on. So you're getting these two cultures diverging. And if you want to read more about the Atlantic tradition, then Facing the Ocean by Barry Cunliffe is an outstanding work. He traces the sort of development of this Atlantic tradition all the way back to the Neolithic period. And just as one example, there are many, but one example of the divergence between the Atlantic and Nordic traditions you can see in the building of houses. So, from the Bronze Age, in the Atlantic area, it's primarily roundhouses and different forms of roundhouses. People like living in the round, building in the round. Their domestic culture must have been sort of circular in some form. Whereas in the Nordic traditional area, the old longhouses, they actually go back further than the Bronze Age, but the concept of living in a longhouse continued. And from the Bronze Age, they start to incorporate the byre within the longhouse itself. And you find continuity with that right up to the Viking period. So in the Atlantic area, you have roundhouses from the Bronze Age that continued to develop right up to the Pictish period, and it's longhouses in the Nordic area. And you might think, well, actually, that it's quite important, this, because houses are a very important part of people's traditional culture, and the way that how you live in a house, and you divide up a house, and you interact with your family in a house. So there's quite a strong divergence from the Bronze Age onwards, which is maintained right up until the early medieval period. And one of the ways of identifying Viking houses in the Scottish Islands is if you come across rectangular structures, then the first thought that comes to mind is it's a Viking house. And you'll often find We'll come to the archaeology later on in more detail, but you'll often find circular houses from an earlier period overlaid by a longhouse on top, and that shows the arrival of a new people, a new culture, a new way of dividing up space. Okay. See, Iceland has fallen out of off the screen again. Hopefully they'll come back. It's okay when I'm doing the talking, but I hope it's not going to happen when it's an Icelander giving a seminar. That could be a bit problematic, but fingers crossed. Any problems today will be ironed out for the coming weeks. Okay, one of the best examples of this divergence that developed between the two cultural zones is the Nordic Bronze Age. And if you're interested in Helleristning, if you know what Helleristning is, that's fantastic. But if you're interested in carved pictures, picture stones, pictographs, then the Nordic Bronze Age is a fascinating example. There are thousands of pictures carved on flat rocks in that area there, the red area, the Nordic Bronze Age area. And these are associated with rituals. They have pictures of warriors, like these warriors at the top. Often the warriors seem to be very excited, as you can see, naked warriors. And there are lots of pictures of ships as well, which is intriguing. And also more sort of obscure pictures, like the sort of circular thing from Austra Almui in Rogaland, which is actually similar to some of the stuff in the Atlantic area, so perhaps there were some intersections. But the depiction of boats and depictions of people you find in the Nordic Bronze Age area, but you don't find in the Atlantic area, so there's a cultural divergence there. And one of the best examples of a cultural icon, if you like, of the Atlantic Bronze Age area is these shields with a notch cut out. You find them in Britain, Ireland, France and Spain. So there's a same sort of custom there. What are they called? They're called cleavage shields. So I put in cleavage shields to see what, on Google, and I got lots of pictures of brook shields. Anyway, so you can see that the Bronze Age areas are sort of divergent from each other. Again, we're not going in any depth, it's just to fill in the picture. But I think the real importance could be, if we follow one particular scholarly line, and that is that it's during the Bronze Age, with these divergent networks, if you like, that we see the beginnings of the origin of the Celtic and Germanic languages. Now, there's a huge amount of debate about this, and there has been for well over 100 years, so it's likely to, not to be finishing anytime soon. But part of the debate is, it's known that both the Celtic languages and the Germanic languages belong to ultimately the same family of languages, Indo-European. There's a debate about where the ancestor of all the Indo-European languages, Proto-Indo-European it's called, originated. And it's debated how it spread throughout Europe and whether it spread as a language that was undifferentiated, or whether it's already had divided up into its daughter languages, if you like, in its homeland, which then spread out in different directions. However, the most recent thinking of John Koch, who is one of the leading Celticists, and Barry Cunliffe, one of the leading archaeologists, is that Proto-Indo-European developed into Celtic within the Atlantic Bronze Age area. Now, I know other Celticists disagree with this, because there's been this idea that Celtic came into the British Isles with invaders from sort of Central Europe. But it's been very difficult to to show such a movement of people. However, it is possible to show the development of a cultural unit over an area that subsequently was shown to have a Celtic languages. So John Koch and Barry Cunliffe have argued very strongly that Celtic languages developed through this network in the British Isles, Ireland, Spain and Portugal. And then when we find Celtic languages outside the zone, it's because the Celtic people have moved eastwards. So, hello Iceland again. You're having problems there. How things?
Yeah, we're falling in and out, but we now have it under control. Thank you.
Very good. I was just introducing people to the hypothesis that John Koch and Barry Cunliffe have come up with and have argued, well, I'm convinced by it at least, that the Celtic languages developed in the Atlantic Bronze Age area because of the close networks there, and that in fact the Celtic languages are autochthonous, if you like, to the British Isles and Spain and Portugal. They didn't come from outside. Proto-Indo-European came in, but it developed into Celtic in these areas. And this turns on its head, this accepted view of the sort of Celtic invasions, which has fallen out of favour because the archaeologists haven't been able to find such a thing. But as I say, these two guys are not just anybody, they are leading figures in their field. And if you want to follow that up, please do. There's Barry Cunliffe's lecture on this, was on YouTube, I saw last year, and John Koch has his PowerPoint, which is at the bottom. You can be accessed through the academia.edu site. And that's a very recent thing, 2014, in which he is answering the critics. So they had their hypothesis and put forward their ideas and their evidence, and then the critics, those with this sort of older fashioned views, if you like, came back at them, and now the critics are being silenced, I think you could put it. But one of the really nice things about this particular view, of course, is that it has an impact on the way that the Celtic languages are viewed. So they're no longer the results that have washed up, if you like, in the British Isles from an invasion that took place 2,500 or 2,800 years ago. They're actually the languages that developed in situ from Proto-Indo-European. So it makes them the ancient and most original languages that we have any evidence of in the British Isles. Okay. So it's well worth exploring. And something similar can be said for the Germanic place names as well. There's the possibility that they developed during the time of the Nordic Bronze Age, because the distribution of the Nordic Bronze Age sites and culture is pretty much exactly the same as where linguists argue the Germanic languages developed. So you could have both then. It's during the Bronze Age that the Celtic families and the Germanic families develop out of Proto-Indo-European, and they develop in the places where they're still found today. Okay, well, whether you want to accept Koch and Cunliffe or not, but I think you should, but even if you don't, the oldest languages that we have evidence of in the British Isles, well, the oldest language is Celtic. So the very first little bits and fragments of information we have are Celtic. So there's, it's called the Massiliot Periplus. It doesn't exist anymore, but it was copied and used by Avienus, when was he, 2nd or 3rd century AD. And this is a sort of a map, if you like, a description of how to sail the sea and how to get to a place where the Albiones and the Hierne live. And John Koch again has shown that these come from Proto-Celtic names, Albiu and Iwerniu, the world and the fat or the fertile country. And Pythias, who we're about to come to soon, he also provided the first evidence of the name for the Britons, the Prytani, and again that is a Celtic name. Okay. So we have Celtic languages in the British Isles as early as we can go back in the sources. And in Norway, we can't go back as far with the sources, but when we get our very first rune stones along the coast of Norway, obviously they're in a Germanic language as well. So this is an example here from Amla from around 450. So we've got our two languages now happily ensconced in Norway and the British Isles and Ireland, and they seem to come from these very early roots from the development of networks in the Nordic area and the Atlantic area. So, got that in our heads now. Let's move forward a bit into the early medieval period. Now, some of this stuff will be old hat to people who have studied the Picts and the Gaels, but still, it's worth just having a quick summary of it before we move on to the contact across the ocean. So pre-Viking Ireland. This is the background that will help you to understand more about the Gaels in Iceland, and will also forewarn you about what to look for when you get a lecture on Old Irish literature. So pre-Viking Ireland, Q Celtic speaking, for those who don't know what that is, Q Celtic and P Celtic are two families of Celtic languages where the initial Proto-Indo-European P, no, sorry, that's not right, where the Proto-Indo-European Q sound in Q Celtic has been maintained and developed into a Q sound, and in P Celtic developed into a P sound. So there are basically, the only point to make here, we're talking about two dialects of the original Celtic language, and in Ireland it's Q Celtic. Before the Viking Age, Ireland had been Christian for a substantial period of time. St. Patrick arrived in Ireland in the mid-5th century, so you can trace the Christianization of Ireland from that time onwards, and then you get the sort of great figures of the Irish Church in the 6th century. St. Columba, for example, arrived in Iona in 563. So you've got this period of Christianization of a traditional society that hadn't been part of the Roman Empire, and in that it shares that with the Germanic areas that were also not part of the Roman Empire. There were very few, if any, towns as such in pre-Viking Ireland. There's some suggestion there might have been some emporia, sort of trading markets, but really the major conurbations, if you like, of pre-Viking Ireland were monastic, and sometimes they're described as monastic towns, but these were aggregations of population. So a monastery like Armagh could, according to one annal entry, 1,000 people could be taken into captivity from Armagh during a Viking raid. So some of these monasteries that developed in Ireland could have been quite sizable, quite large populations. That's not to say that everybody who lived in a monastery was a monk. There were lay members who did the farming and did other community things in the monasteries as well. The reason that monasteries developed in Ireland is the very fact that there were no towns. So there weren't places where you could put important churches, as had happened in the Roman Empire. So monasticism was adopted as a way of developing the church, and each of the small Irish tuatha, which we're about just to come to, small kingdoms, well, not everyone, but a lot of them had their own monastery and developed their own monastery once they became Christian. The most important feature, I think, of pre-Viking Ireland, however, was the fact that it was a literate society. And of course, not everybody was literate, but many people were literate in Latin and in Old Irish. The fact that they were actually writing in Old Irish is a very intriguing and interesting feature, and that's one that will be picked up when looking at the Gaels in Iceland, because this was an unusual feature to adopt literacy from Latin and then apply it to your traditional language. And Ireland has an extraordinary corpus of literary material. Ancient laws were transcribed into Old Irish, and also a great saga tradition, not different from the Icelandic saga tradition, but traditional stories, legends, histories, a whole range of things. I'm going to mention a few just shortly. But the very fact that they did this was a unique feature of their culture, and it's been said that by the existence of Old Irish, which is the ancestral language of modern Gaelic and modern Scottish Gaelic, Gaelic has the oldest written tradition north of the Alps. There's debate about whether you can say that or not, but that is what people say. It was a warlike society. It had a warrior elite. It was a heroic society, and it was also a very dispersed society. There were hierarchies of tribes and kingdoms, but each of these was often waging war against its neighbours. And we see this when the Vikings arrive in Ireland, that they fit in quite nicely into an already existing warlike community. And ultimately, in fact, they are, once things sort of, once the pebble in the pond effect sort of dies down a little bit and the Vikings are settled in Ireland, they are accepted just like any of the other warlike kingdoms that already existed in Ireland. So the Irish weren't a pushover, shall we say, when the Vikings arrived. They were quite capable of waging war against the Vikings, and in fact also having victories against the Vikings. Unfortunately, however, they weren't very good at maintaining alliances against the Vikings, because they would tend to break down and they would end up fighting each other. So, but no doubt we'll come back to that in due course. There were probably something around 100, that's a very rough figure, but 100 small kingdoms in Ireland in the pre-Viking period. And they were called tuatha. And the other translation for tuath is people or tribe. So these were the sort of the bedrock of the community. And each of these had a king or a ri with royal status. So that's why you get a lot of warfare and fighting going on. But there were hierarchies of kings as well. So a king of a tuath could owe allegiance to a king of several tuatha, who in turn could owe allegiance to the king of a province. So there were these ways of bringing larger, increasing the size of your society, but it was always fractious and always likely to collapse as the king of one tuath fell out with the king of the tuath next door. And another feature that tended to lead to that was the tradition of the town, which was where, because you lived in a heroic society, the king would lead raids into neighbouring tuatha to steal their cattle or to go on a crech. So it was a land of perennial warfare, as well as being a land of monasteries and Christianity. Probably, from our perspective, a very unusual society, I would say. The church was one of the ways that the community was connected together. But even so, the monasteries that were associated with particular tribes could fall out with each other just as well as the tribes themselves. And Lucas, who's looked at the Viking impact on the churches of Ireland, made the case that, in fact, the Irish themselves had been raiding their monasteries for centuries before the Vikings actually got there. You didn't raid your own monastery, you raided the monastery of your neighbours. Perhaps not quite as violently as the Vikings did, but still, on occasion, monasteries could go to war with each other. There's a record of that in the 8th century. Okay, as I say, it's just a pencil sketch. You'll learn more about this as we go through the module. But it's just to give you a kind of a picture in your mind of the type of people that the Gaels were, because the people who lived in Ireland were the Gaels, okay, the Goidels, as the word was at that time, and they spoke Old Gaelic. This is a map, clearly, and this is a map of the provinces of Ireland. Now, this is just to give you some idea of the larger units that the Tuatha could draw together but it's a bit it's not totally, what's the word? These look like kingdoms. These look like hard and fast units. These different provinces. Well, they might have been hard and fast ideas, but they never really functioned as strong units because they were made up of so many parts in below. But it does give you an idea of the major territories within Ireland. And they're still with us today. So we have Connaught in the west, and Munster in the south, and Leinster in the east, and Ulster in the north. So the origins of the division of Ireland into 5 provinces, the Coicíd, goes back to the pre-Viking era. Okay, another pencil sketch. Scotland. In many ways, Scotland was very similar to pre-Viking Ireland. It was made up of different kingdoms, but unlike Ireland, which seems to have been one linguistic cultural unit, despite being broken up into lots of little kingdoms, Scotland, as we know it today, was divided between 4 different peoples. And each of these had contact with the Vikings. In 870, the Britons of Strathclyde, Dumbarton, underwent a 4-month siege with the Vikings. In 839, the Picts the king of the Picts was killed, and the nobles of Pictland, and in fact the Gaelic nobles of Dalriada as well, were killed by the Vikings. So they all had their run-in with the Vikings. The Picts, Gaels and Britons, Celtic people, the Angles, a Germanic people, similar in many ways to the Norse. But there was a linguistic difference between the Picts and the Britons on the one hand and the Gaels on the other, in that the Picts and the Britons were P-Celtic speakers and the Gaels were the same Q-Celtic speakers as their Gaelic brethren in Ireland. And it's the Gaels of Ireland and the Gaels of Argyll that are going to feature more in the subsequent lectures about the Celtic influence and impact in Iceland and in the Nordic world. Although the Pictish one shouldn't be forgotten as well, but it's more difficult to trace. Okay. Again, though, just if you haven't come across this stuff before, it's just important to realise that both in Ireland and Scotland you're talking about Celtic peoples, and you're talking about societies that are split up into different smaller units. And in Scotland's case, you have a variety of different ethnic groups, which makes it more like the Balkans, I suppose, than one might otherwise imagine. So the Gaels...
Just sorry to interrupt again. Just a quick question about language and groupings of people. That picture that you showed was a good demonstration of territory and ethnic groups. But as you're probably aware, the language overlays sometimes do not represent the actual ethnicity of the individuals in the grouping. Classic example is modern day Scotland. We speak English, or I speak English, but my grandparents spoke Gaelic. So the language doesn't always... I think what I'm getting at is, as the Picts disappear off the map, as a political identity or a linguistic identity, do the cultural or the people themselves remain but speaking another language?
Yeah, it's a very good question. The Picts, they actually leave sort of stage left or whatever around 900. It's a very complicated story. Gaelic was making its way into Pictland before the disappearance of the Picts from the record. Then there's a story that's developed in the 12th century about the demise of the Picts, that they were conquered and destroyed by the Gaels under Kenneth MacAlpine. But more recent historiography has suggested that that is in fact an explanation of the disappearance of the language of Picts and or the ethnicity of the Picts. You can see that Kenneth MacAlpine in the traditional annals is called King of the Picts. His sons are called King of the Picts, and the first one who's called the King of Alapa is his grandson, Constantine. And it seems to be around 900. And from 900 onwards, the Picts are never mentioned anymore. So, and it gets progressively more Gaelic in tradition, and you get the establishment of a lot of Gaelic place names, probably at that time, maybe earlier, but it's probably from around 900 in eastern Scotland. You get the Bala and Achuch place names. So there's something going on in Pictland in the latter half of the 9th century, which we'll have to come back to at some point, because it's probably due to the impact of the Norse on the traditional societies of Scotland at that time. The Norse attack Pictland and probably destroy the existing elite, which in some form or other are by a Gaelic-speaking elite, rather than a conquest. But something happens which makes Pictish a language that people no longer want to speak, and by around 900 or a little bit after that have ceased to speak, and they're speaking Gaelic instead. But the actual mechanism by which that took place is very difficult to actually trace. But the people who live in what used to be Pictland during the 10th and 11th century identify themselves as Gaels, and that's why they adopt the name Scot, because Scot is the Latin for Gael. It's often meant Irish, but it's effectively Gael. So you do see the adoption of a new ethnicity, which must have had some basis in people movement and also linguistic change and political upheaval. But before the Viking Age, which was what this is showing, it's likely that it was easier to trace the difference between the different areas, shall we put it that way. The Pictish kingdom existed. It's mentioned in Anglo-Saxon and Irish sources. The kings of the Picts, the Pictish king list from before the Viking Age has been preserved in later copies. So we have no doubt that there was a kingdom, sometimes two kingdoms. And what exactly we mean by a kingdom, that's another question in this early medieval period. But there was some kind of political royal unit of the Picts that was recognised as such by its neighbours. And similarly, there was a kingdom of the Gaels in Argyll, which was known as Dalriata, which was also the same name as in the north of Ireland. And the Britons, they also had a kingdom which was recognised by the neighbours, which was called Strathclyde. And the Angles belongs to the kingdom of Northumbria, which from the 7th and 8th centuries was, well, certainly in the 7th century, was the most powerful kingdom in the whole of the Isle of Britain. So there's more than just language and sort of ethnicity, who we are and who we think we are. There was also the fact that these kingdoms existed and they were recognised as such by their neighbours.
Yep. Good. Thank you.
And I'll quickly go through this now because we've got quite a lot to cover. But that's where the Gaelic population of pre-Viking Scotland was concentrated, in the traditional kingdom of Dalriada. And Dalriada also spread, well, it didn't spread into Northern Ireland, it was in Northern Ireland first, according to the traditional story. Dalriada, it means the portion or the part of somebody called Riata, and around 500 or thereabouts, Dalriada had spread and into what is now Argyll as well. And in fact, the place name Argyll means Oraghail, means the coastline of the Gael too. So it's we know that the Gaelic-speaking area was focused in southwestern Highlands. There may have been Gaels spreading up through the Great Glen. There may have been Gaels going across towards Stirling and into Perthshire. There may have been Gaels in the monasteries of Pictland. There may have been Gaels in the Outer Hebrides of Scotland as well, but they were focused in that particular area. And that's Dunab, one of the pre-Viking hill forts, centres of power in Dalriada. The Picts, a bit more mysterious, but there's been a lot of work done on the Picts over the last few years. We can trace the political history of the Picts. We now know that they were the most powerful people in what is now Scotland, and that they dominated the Gaelic-speaking area pretty much right up until the arrival of the Vikings. They were likely to be literate as well. We just don't have any of their written sources surviving. I should say that the Gaels of Dalriada were literate too, and they've produced some of the greatest works of early medieval literature, such as the Life of Columba by Athafnan, which we're going to come across again. So right in the heart of Dalriada was Iona, which was a cultural centre of early medieval Europe. The Picts, a bit more mysterious, as I say, but we know that they spoke pre-Celtic. We have their place names that prove that to us. And we have the names of their kings, and we know that they were involved in the politics of northern Britain, interacting with the Gaels and with the Angles of Northumbria. And their culture spread to the north, so it encompassed Orkney and Shetland. We don't know, again, this question of ethnicity, how Pictish the people of Orkney and Shetland were, but we do know that they exhibited aspects of Pictish culture and that they shared in the understanding of what Pictish symbols meant. One of the defining features of Pictish art is the existence of Pictish symbol stones, which obviously had a meaning to the Picts, and a lot of work has been done on to try and interpret this meaning, and we're still no further on, apart from the fact that Glasgow University, I think, has proven that it is a form of writing. So it's a very basic form of writing, but it's sort of a form of writing. So they may represent parts of names, for example. But let's not get into that. There's so many opposing theories. Enough for our purposes to say that the Northern Isles, there must have been people who understood the meaning of these symbols. And we also get Ogham inscriptions, quite a lot of Ogham inscriptions in Shetland. Ogham was a type of writing that developed in Ireland in the 3rd century AD, which was making lines at different angles on an edge of a stone. and it was originally used to write primitive Irish, sort of the precursor of Old Irish, but eventually it was adopted by the Picts as well, and they used it to write Pictish, and we have a series of Pictish oghams from Shetland. So we know that Orkney and Shetland were part of the Pictish world, and some people, at least in Orkney and Shetland, could speak and write Pictish in their ogham inscriptions. And in fact, the more that we find out about Orkney and Shetland in the pre-Viking period, the more we realise how Pictish the island groups became. They might have been slightly different from the mainland, around the year 0, but certainly as you approach the Viking period, the connections between Orkney and Shetland and the Pictish kingdom are clear to see, and new material is being found all the time which highlights this fact. This is the Iron Age site at Scatness, which has been excavated by Bradford University over over a decade, and this was an important centre. It was originally a broch, and then for about, before the Vikings, I think, for about 1,000 years, give or take, it was the centre of an important, eventually an important Pictish farm. And go back a bit. And it's provided evidence of a Pictish stone and connections with the mainland, and also connections with the Roman world at an earlier period too. So we find more and more about the as more excavations are carried out, we find more and more evidence for connections between the Northern Isles and the Pictish area. And in the Outer Hebrides, it seems to be similar. The connections between the Outer Hebrides seem to be, at least as far as archaeology is concerned, with Pictland rather than with the Gaelic polity of Dalriatha in Argyll. So the same kind of burial practices have been found in Barra, in the Outer Hebrides, and in Shetland and in Caithness. So there's something to be explored there. It looks as if the Outer Hebrides may have a bit more in common with the Pictish side of the Scottish equation. Okay. Right, okay. So with, I just skated across that, but was there any contact then between this developing Celtic area and Norway? Well, I think there might have been. Obviously, the two areas were distinct and, following their own path. But there seems to be a little bit of evidence that there was a connection, certainly between the Northern Isles and Norway in the pre-Viking period. And the odd thing is that the connection could have been from the British Isles to Norway rather than the other way around. I say could be because there's maybe evidence to the contrary as well. But we're imbued with this sense that the Vikings sort of created something new. They opened up the seaways. They came from the east and they settled in the west, and they came across the sea, and that was a new era, and that was when the contacts were made. But in fact, there's little bits of evidence suggests that the connections were much earlier in the Viking Age, and that it was from the west to the east. And one of the bits of evidence for that, or the evidence that might make that possible at least, is that the Celtic areas had the sail for at least 1,000 years before the Norse had the sail. So they were able to sail their boats around against the wind in a way that the Norse weren't. Okay, so let's explore this a little bit more. Imagine you're in Shetland in the Pictish period, and you have a boat with a sail. It could be a leather boat, but you've got a boat with a sail, and something happens and you get blown off course. It would not be very difficult to arrive in Norway, because there are several occasions when people in Shetland, in historical times, have had the misfortune of being blown across to Norway. It only takes, well, it can take a long time if you're unfortunate, but it can just take sort of 48 hours if the wind's blowing in the right direction. The distance is not huge. This is an example here of Betty Mowat in the late 19th century. She was delivering, I can't remember exactly what the story was, but she found herself on the boat, anyway, the Columbine, and the two guys that were supposed to be sailing it sort of fell off. And she was left in the boat with the sail out, and she couldn't sail herself, and she was just put at the mercy of the winds, and eventually ended up on the west coast of Norway, where she was looked after and helped out by the people there. It became a sort of famous story. But she wasn't the only one. There was a story from Unst as well of two children that got into a boat by mistake and were blown across to Norway as well. So it's not difficult anyway. The distance is not difficult to traverse, she'll put it that way. It's also possible to row from Norway to Shetland. Why would they row? Because the sail doesn't seem to be much adopted along the coast of Norway until around 800. The evidence we have is that the ships used along the coast of Norway were rowed up until that point. Even the great ship burial at Storhaug in Avaldsnes, which we know from dendrochronology was actually buried in the year 771, doesn't seem to have had a sail. So it's more awkward to do the trip from Norway to the Northern Isles, obviously without a sail. But it is possible to row, and it's certainly possible to row the opposite direction as well, because the local Yule rowing team from Trondra here in Shetland rowed across to Norway a few years ago, and it took them 48 hours to make the trip. So again, just to make the point, we're not talking enormous distances, but we are talking being out of sight of land for several hours. Is that somebody want to say something? Nope. Okay. I'm just filling this in before I give you the little bits of evidence that suggests that there was this contact. We know that the Picts and the Gaels were seafaring people. There's one of the only documents to survive from Dalriatha from the 7th or 8th century is called the Shanachas Fernalpin, which is a sort of a census of the tribes of Dalriatha and the what they owe the king of Dalriatha in the form of they have to provide so many boats for his retinue when he's going to war. That's the way to put it. So we know that the people of Dalriatha had boats, and that they had actually kept records of how many boats the various people had. And we have annal entries of people from Dalriatha actually attacking Orkney. So Aidan mac Gavran was a king of Dalriatha in 580. So he was able to launch a seaborne attack on Orkney. The king of the Picts, Brede, also launched a seaborne attack on Orkney almost a century later. So we know they had ships. The first sea battle ever recorded in the British Isles was long before the Viking Age. It was recorded in 719 in Dalriatha. So that was actually a battle of one fleet against another. And we hear of a Pictish fleet being wrecked off Ross Cusina, which is Troop Head on the just sort of north of, on the north coast from Aberdeen, if you like. And it mentions 150 ships. Of course, that could be a gross exaggeration, but later Viking raids, the numbers of ships mentioned can be 150 or 200. So we don't have a lot of information about the fleets of Dalriatha and the fleets of Pictland. But we can't ignore these contemporary annal entries that they actually had them. Where they went with them, though, of course, is a different matter. But they certainly could sail them up to Orkney and Shetland. And there's a picture of of a boat there on the St. Orlands stone, which probably predates the Viking age as well. So, the only point of this really is to say that the Celtic people of the British Isles and Ireland were perfectly capable of sailing and going across the sea in the pre-Viking age. And there's a nice little example of this. The Broiter boat from the 1st century BC, found in the Broiter Hoard in Ireland. It's a gold boat, and all the details are there: the oars, the benches, and the mast. So a boat like this, quite capable of sailing around the coast of Ireland and heading off further afield if need be. So this is the Atlantic tradition, lots of boats with sails. Which brings me to Pytheas, who I mentioned earlier. We know that Pytheas explored the British Isles and the sea to the north of the British Isles in around 325 BC. We know that for a fact, but we don't know where he went. We do know that he circumnavigated Britain and he measured it. We also know that he was along the coast of the Netherlands in Denmark, but when he got to the north of Britain, there's some debate about where he went. Did he go to Iceland or did he go to Norway? From our perspective, perhaps not so important really, because it's been argued that he didn't set off on his journey from Marseille in a great trireme or anything, one of these big Greek ships that one might imagine. But in fact, he used native ships whenever he travels. He went to ports and he used the local ships. And he used the local knowledge as well about where he was going to go. This is Barry Cunliffe again, who's written a very good account of Pytheas. So the general opinion now is that Pytheas did his great exploration using native ships and native tradition. So when he got to the north of Britain, whichever direction he went, he made use of local sailing abilities and tradition. And he went where the locals took him. Now, I'm not going to get into this in particular depth, but it will be on the PowerPoint, so you can have a look at it and maybe come back with some suggestions. I think I'll put this up on as one of the discussion points, actually. Did Pytheas go to Iceland or Norway? There are completely different opinions about this, but nobody seriously believes that he didn't make his way around Britain and that he got to the most northerly point of Britain and then headed off in a local boat somewhere or other. And the problem is that his own account of his expedition didn't survive, but it's only in fragments in other later classical authors, some who didn't believe him in the first place. So there's you only get these little fragmentary bits, and it's very difficult to put them together into a coherent picture of exactly where he went. And this is a bit of a problem because everybody wants to know where Thule was, because it's Pytheas who first mentions Thule, the most northerly place, that was 6 days' sail north from Britain. And lots of scholarly effort has been put into proving one case or the other. Thule is a sort of mysterious place that sort of floats around, depending on which author is using the term and which scholar is arguing the case. It's clear that later, in the writings of Dicule in the 9th century, that he uses Thule to mean Iceland, but it's not clear that Pytheas's Thule was Iceland. So there's a bit of a debate there, so have a look at that if you're interested in that particular side of things. However, the other thing he talks about, which he says that the inhabitants near the frozen zone, or at least one of the fragments in a later source says, the inhabitants inhabit the frozen zone, live on millet, and they pointed out to him where the sun sort of dipped behind the sun went to sleep, as it were. And he also mentions that this place that he visited, well, I'll start again. Roseman has managed to extract all the references to Pythias in all the classical sources, and she says that the place that he's describing is at least 62 degrees north, perhaps 64 degrees. That being the case, and this is the inhabited bit that he's talking about, it can't be the north of Scotland, because Shetland is the most northerly bit, and that's at 60 degrees. So it seems clear that Pythias did go somewhere north of Shetland, and using local sailors to do it. And it could be that the bit when he's talking about people who live in the far north, that he was in Norway, which could be this sort of little fragment of evidence of a connection between the British Isles, the Atlantic zone, and the Nordic zone, but coming from this side over. Now, we know that the people in the Northern Isles had connections, and this is just a little thing I throw out just to make you think. We're going to get on to more meaty stuff just in a second. The Scatness bear, this is the Pictish symbol that was discovered in the Scatness archaeological dig in the one of the Pictish houses from the pre-Viking era. And it has a beautiful carving of a bear. This bear was in a prominent position that you could see when you went in the front door on the other side of the fireplace, on one of the sort of the wall totally facing the door, so it was obvious to people coming in. It seems to have been carved from life. Somebody must have seen a bear to be able to carve it. And there are no bears in Shetland, of course. Well, there were bears in Scotland, and there were bears in Scandinavia, and there were polar bears somewhere to the far north at the time that the Scatness bear was carved. So it's evidence of some seaborne contact somewhere from the Northern Isles, but difficult to actually identify which. There's just a little mystery, don't pay too much attention, but it's one of these things that is difficult to actually explain. Yes, okay, but it's probably evidence of Orkney and Shetland people being able to sail around, shall we say. Okay. That's just the thing. There's been a lot of work done on fish bones from the pre-Viking and the Viking period in archaeological digs in both Orkney and Shetland, and it's clear that if the pre-Viking Shetlanders and Orcadians had boats and liked to sail about, they didn't bother going deep sea fishing. That's so, because there's no evidence in their bones for the eating of vast amounts of fish. Right, okay. I'm just trying to paint a picture that there were people sailing about and there was potential for sailing. So what's some of the evidence that it actually took place? Well, we have some strange place names in Shetland, which could be evidence of early contact from before the Viking Age. And these are known as Usamanset names. If they'd been in Norway, they would be Usamanset names, so uncombined names. And uncombined names for islands and for various topographical features tend to be very old. And we have three names in Shetland, three island names, that don't have the normal Norse I at the end. They're just named, sort of uncombined names. And if they were in Norway, they would automatically be considered by Norwegian place name scholars to be old Norse names predating 500. And these are Unst, Jel, and Fetla. Unst has early forms like Ernst and Aumster, which look very similar to an island name, Aumar, in Kvitsøy in Norway. And Aumar has been identified, or it's been suggested that comes from either aumio, meaning a favour or protection, or from an Indo-European root, av, meaning wave or sea, reference to strong currents. Now, it's possible that this particular root could also be the origin for the earliest form of the name Ernst. So, as I say, if it was in Norway, there would be no trouble. People would just automatically assume it was a Usamannsat old Norse name, a pre-Norse name. Yell, it's a similar one. There are names in Norway, like originally Jali, Jeløya, which is originally Jali, which comes from an old root meaning to sing or to shriek, which has been, like in Jelsa, another name in Rogaland, suggesting a place where there's the shrieking of seabirds, which fits parts of Yell, at least, the cliffs. So again, if it was Norway, there would be no problem. It would be one of these very old names. And Fetla, similarly, is similar to a word Fitjar in Norway, which goes back to an old root, meaning a lush piece of grassland. So what we do to think about these names, one option is that they are contact names. So they predate the Viking Age. So that they're names that were known in Norway for islands that were across the sea, that they picked up in some way. Perhaps they'd come across in rowing boats, or perhaps sailing boats from Shetland had gone across to Norway and passed on the names. They could be sort of Norse tweaks of pre-Norse names, but the fact that they're so similar to Usamannsat Norwegian island names is reasonable evidence, or arguable evidence anyway, that these are names that the Vikings knew before they set out on their trips in the Viking Age. Very old names, evidence of this contact before 500 AD. If they were just alone, then you could maybe just ignore them, but there's also other little bits and pieces which are interesting. The fact that the Old Norse, the Vikings had the name Orkneyjar for Orkney is intriguing. That's a borrowing. We know from classical sources that this name is much older than the Vikings. Classical sources is Orkades. So that's been a borrowing into Norse. But when did this borrowing take place? The fact that it's got this N in the middle also makes it look like some of the earliest Norwegian island names, because some of them have either a suffix N at the end. So Churn, for example. Again, they're pre-500. So if the name had been Orkeyjar without the N, then you might have said it was just a borrowing in the Viking Age. But the fact it's got an N is very odd. It does make it look as if it's being treated as one of these very old Norwegian island names. So. And the name for Shetland as well is potentially old and predating the Viking Age. There are a series of land names in Norway for small territorial areas, early kingdoms, which are very old. And they go back to the migration period, and they're a combination of a people name and a land. So they are the land of that such and such a people. Hjaltland seems to be, the Old Norse form of Shetland, seems to be treated in a very similar way, because the inhabitants of Hjaltland, we have a couple of references to them. They're not known as Hjaltlendingur, the people of Hjaltland, if you like. They're known as the Hjaltar. They are the Hjalts, if you like. So it's the land of the Hjalts, which is a direct parallel with Hordaland, the land of the Hordes, or Rogaland, the land of the Rugi, which goes back to the migration period. So if Hjaltland had turned up on the mainland of Norway, for example, there would be no doubt it was one of these very old names, a pre-Viking one. The word Hjalt for a Shetlander continued in Norway. So you get references to people as somebody Hjelt right up into the early modern period. It's a sort of an ethnonym, the name of a people, sort of nationality, if you like. And if it is the tribal name, there's a couple of options that it might go back to, depending on how far you want to go back in time. And I just leave that one there as a possibility. There are other possibilities. I think, without going into the realm of inventive etymology, the very fact that you have this combination of land with an ethnonym is reasonable. That it's reasonable that we're talking about a very old name, along with Orkneyar and Unst, Yell and Fettler. Okay, so potentially very old names. So the people in the coast of Norway had those names in their onomasticon, if you like. They knew that these places lay out to the west through contact. Is it possible that there were actually people of the Nordic tradition living in Shetland before the Viking Age? Well, there's one little bit of evidence for that, but we'll pass on for the moment. There's one archaeological site. There was a longhouse at Norwich that was excavated by Beverley Ballant Smith, which produced a couple of very old carbon-14 dates, which seem to predate the Viking Age. So it is possible that there were some Norse starting to settle in Shetland before the Viking Age, but perhaps it's there have to be more of examples of places like Norwich before we can be sure of that. But I think the place names are reasonable evidence of awareness, and certainly from the Celtic side, there's evidence that the inhabitants had seaworthy boats that could take them around the British Isles and further afield. So more evidence that they could travel further afield. We've seen already that Pythias might have done so. Well, actually, I think we can say he did do so, but in which direction, that is a bit more difficult. We know that even by the Iron Age, St Kilda, which is the sort of most isolated of the Western Isles, was inhabited. And not only the main island of St Kilda, but one of the very difficult islands to access, which is Borary, which is a little picture there. That's not, that hasn't been tweaked, that hasn't been sort of pulled up to make it look more obscure, more difficult to get onto than it is. That's it. That does look as sharp and steep as that. And that had settlement, or at least activity on it, in the Iron Age. So people were able to sail across to St Kilda and to move about within the islands of St Kilda as far back as that point. But what I want to look at now is the evidence for the expeditions of Gaelic-speaking clerics into the Atlantic, of which there's reasonable evidence, and before the Viking Age. So this is Gaelic monks seeking deserta. Now it's St Adavnan, who wrote the life of St Columba. He says that people sought out to deserta in the ocean. This was a tradition that goes all the way back to the Middle East, when holy men and women went into the desert to mortify the flesh and to get closer to God and to escape from the hubbub of everyday life. So it didn't always work, because if you became a famous holy person living in the desert, then people came to look at you. And that's what happened to the Stylites who lived up on the top of poles. People came round down below and watched them. So it didn't always work. But this idea of heading into the desert was adopted by the church in the Gaelic areas. But of course there isn't really any desert as such around Ireland or Dalriada, but there is the ocean. So it was the same idea as it was applied to heading off into the ocean and looking for somewhere to set yourself up as a hermit, cut off from everyday life. And the most famous of these figures heading off to sort of get closer to God is St. Brendan, who died in 577. We don't have a contemporary account really of St. Brendan. He's mentioned in Adhavnan, his Life of Columba, but he's a contemporary of St. Columba. But we do have a very old text about him, the Navigatio Sancti Brendani, which dates to the 7th or 8th century. And I've put a copy of that on the VLE, so you can read it for yourself and see what you make of it. Some people, of course, take it, I'm not going to say seriously. You should take it seriously, it's a serious work, but some people look at the details in it and make sort of simplistic assumptions that the island of glass that he sees is an iceberg, etc., etc. So that's been done since people have read this. For the last couple of hundred years, people have been making these assumptions, and that Tim Severin took the Navigatio as the basis for his voyage, which he successfully managed to do to the Faroe Islands, Iceland, Greenland, and Newfoundland. But most scholars of 9th, 8th century Irish literature believe it's more of a metaphysical work rather than a description of a real voyage. That's not to say that he didn't carry out real voyages, because he was known as St. Brendan the Navigator. But whether he went as far out into the sea as later interpreters imagine is something, of course, quite different, because he became very popular in the Middle Ages, and his story was told. It was a very widespread story, and his voyages grew in the telling, as it were. David Dunville, who is really the expert on, he's expert on many things, but early Christian Ireland and the monastic culture of Ireland, he thinks that it shouldn't be used as simplistic evidence for the monks living on Atlantic islands. That's not to say that they didn't live on them, as we'll see, but he thinks you shouldn't use the Navigatio as evidence for that. It's more a metaphysical work of the seeking paradise in the ocean and trying to escape from the terrors of hell. But he's not alone, St. Brendan, so we don't have to just say because the Navigatio is metaphysical doesn't mean anyone else went places. There's more to it than that. We know that St. Columba went on a voyage. He didn't go on a voyage across far to the west, but he did leave Ireland and set himself up in Iona, and he was following a tradition when he did that, which was voluntary isolation. It was a form of martyrdom. You could have red martyrdom where you were killed for your belief, or white martyrdom where you left Ireland and went somewhere else and put up with the struggles and problems that accrued from doing that. So St. Columba, he did that, established his monastery on a small island outside of Ireland, and Iona became the cultural centre, as we mentioned, of one of the cultural centres of early medieval Europe. Okay. But even if we leave St. Brendan aside, we have the accounts of Cormac Ualiafoin, who also went on some extraordinary voyages. His 3 voyages are mentioned in Adhavnan's Life of Columba, partly because St. Columba is supposed to have helped him on his voyages, and also foretold the troubles that would happen when Cormac set off into the ocean. As you can see, the voyage, we don't have a lot of details about where he went, but we have some. The first voyage from north of Connaught into the ocean. The second one is a very interesting one because there's a large account in the life of Columba about Columba's visit to Bride, the king of the Picts. And one of the things he discusses is that when Cormac arrives in Orkney, please tell the underking of Orkney not to kill him, but let him be. So he reached Orkney, according to Adamnan, on his second voyage, but his third voyage is the most mysterious and extraordinary one. He got caught. The wind was blowing in a certain direction. This is the one that St. Columba mentioned, and is supposed to have helped out by miraculously changing the wind direction after 14 days. So 14 summer days and nights have been blown in some direction north of Britain. We don't know exactly where he set out from. It's not. No text tells us, but it doesn't really matter because anywhere, even if it was from the north coast of Ireland or the north coast of Britain or Orkney or Iona, if you sail 14 days in one direction with the wind forcing you, that is, you've gone a tremendous distance. I tried to work it out once and then gave up because, I mean, you don't know where you're starting from, so you don't know where you're going to end up. But if we imagine it takes roughly 48 hours to go from Shetland to the west coast of Norway, well, multiply that by 7, and you've got, about 1,000 miles or thereabouts from somewhere. So that covers a huge area of the North Atlantic. Possibly Jan Mayen, Svalbard, who knows. The interesting thing also is that Adamnan mentions all the parts of the boat. So we have a good idea of what a typical boat that one of these adventurers, these monastic heroes set off in. So we get the full range. We know it's a leather boat. This is what was used by Tim Severin, as part of his evidence for building his boat for the St. Brendan voyage. But we have a keel, prow, stern, built of leather, a mast, sail yard, sail and rigging. So the complete set, if you like. And as I say, we're talking here about, 700, a good century before we have evidence that the people of the west coast of Norway were using sail. There's evidence that people in the Baltic, the Scandinavian population of the Baltic, say around Gotland, may have been using the sail. But if we're talking about the Norwegians, it's only around 800 that we start to have evidence of the use of the sail. The voyages of St. Brendan, the Cormac, something's going on. People are heading off into the ocean in search of enlightenment and peace. And from this period we also get a series of voyage tales in Old Irish literature. So there's obviously a great interest in this activity. And here are a list of 4 of them, at least. These are extraordinary tales of, they're a bit like Odysseys, the heroes head off and they reach lots of different islands, and each different island has a different effect and some different adventures happen in them. Imrav, sort of rowing about, I suppose is a possible translation of what that word means. So we have this genre of literature being created, a good century before the Viking Age in Ireland, about heroes who set off into the sea and visit islands. And a typical example here is the Imrav Maladun, which is, I won't read through them just now, we don't have time, but these are the islands that Maladun visits. And of course, a lot of them are not real islands, if any of them, but it still gives an idea that people thought that heading off and visiting islands was a way to reach enlightenment and have excitement and gain holiness. So I'll leave that up beyond the PowerPoint, so you can have a look at the examples there. But a typical example is the island with maidens and intoxicating drink. That's one of the more attractive islands. There's an island of ants, which doesn't sound so good, but the island of maidens and intoxicating drink, that's sort of a place that most people would think, yeah, we'll head there. But of course, within the context of the Imrav, that's a place of temptation, so you're not tempted by that, and you head off for a more peaceful island. We have clear physical evidence of this activity that was taking place, and probably the greatest example is Skellig Hill off the west coast of Ireland, which is is the typical eremitical monastery, bar none. I should say an eremitical monastery. It's a sort of strange. It's a strange term. A monastery you think of as a place where people live together under God, and a hermit is a person who goes away and meets God, themselves, as it were. So an eremitical monastery is a place where people go off to be alone together. Okay, it's a strange concept, but we have evidence of these types of things. But Skellig Hill, established probably in the 6th century, continued to be used and inhabited as a monastery right up until about the 12th or 13th century. Was attacked by the Vikings, and the abbot was Etzgale, died in captivity. So even a place like that wasn't safe from the Vikings, but it gives an idea that why they would go to a place like that to be in the wild. And the North Atlantic is full of places like that would be attractive to people seeking that kind of inspiration. We have a good one in Scotland, North Rona, which is a very isolated island, most isolated island ever to be inhabited in Scotland. And it has an early Christian church on it. There it is, that's North Rona there in its geographical context. So, very difficult to get to. People, later populations died of starvation there. It was not the greatest place in the world, but it does have this early church dedicated to St. Ronan, who, well, there's lots of stories about, but he may have been a saint who had his cult may have been in the north of Lewis and parts of Orkney and Shetland. There's some interesting references to him. But at any rate, the island was dedicated to him, and this church, and it's a bipartite church. The old bit is on the right, that's pre-Viking, and the younger bit's on the left. That's a sort of 12th or 13th century bit added on, and there are early Christian crosses there as well. But it was definitely used as a church site before the Viking Age. That brings us to the Came of Isbister, which I said has been suggested as one of these sites. And there's a range of them around Shetland as well. You can just make it out there across the Elsund from another typical site, very similar site on the other side. And it seems as if these people, they didn't just make it to obscure places off the coast of Ireland, off the north coast of Scotland, off the coast of Shetland. They seem to, and I don't think there's any real reason to doubt the word of Thicke, who was writing a contemporary geography of the world around 825, to doubt him as a source for a contemporary account of these people also making it to the Faroe Islands and to Iceland. That's the complete reference there, so have a look at it when you have a chance. But the important thing here is that he mentions Thule again, and this time Thule is pretty clearly being, is Iceland. And it's a personal account. He has been told by somebody who has been there. Because Vikings himself says that before he went to France, where he was writing this account, he had been in the Hebrides somewhere, probably in Iona. There's some debate about that. But while there, he'd met clerics who'd been somewhere else, who have this story to tell. It's now 30 years since clerics who'd lived on the island from the 1st of February to the 1st of August told me that not only at the summer solstice, but on the days round about it, the sun setting in the evening hides itself as though behind a small hill in such a way that there was no darkness in that very small space of time, and a man could do whatever he wished, as though the sun were there, even remove lice from his shirt, and if they had been on a mountain top, perhaps the sun would never have been hidden from them. And he says that this place, he follows Pliny, that Thule lies 6 days sail to the north of Britain. If you get the sailing right, in the right direction, you can get from either Ireland or the coast of Britain to Iceland in 6 days. So, I think this is, some people doubt this, but I don't see why we should. It sounds like a very good account of clerics having made it to Iceland. It's just that little reference to you could remove lice from your shirt if you needed to. It sort of brings it home. And then he also mentions another set of islands which have caused a little bit of debate. There's a debate about whether they refer to the Faroe Islands or not, but again, it seems likely. If we look at the second bit, 15 here, there's another set of small islands nearly separated by narrow stretches of water. In these, for nearly 100 years, hermits sailing from our country, Ireland, have lived. But just as they were deserted from the beginning of the world, so now, because of the Northman pirates, they are emptied of anchorites and are filled with countless sheep and very many diverse kinds of seabirds. I've never found these islands mentioned in the authorities. Now, that sounds very like the Faroes. They are separated by narrow stretches of water. They have sheep, and that could be the etymology of the name. The Faroes, the Færeyjar, the sheep islands. They aren't mentioned in any previous source. So it's entirely possible, although there is a debate. It has been suggested that it could be a reference to Shetland. The only problem with it being Shetland is that he says that they were deserted from the beginning of the world, and we know that there's plenty of evidence of populations in Shetland going all the way back to the Neolithic period. So even if there was nobody alive on Shetland when the clerics were there, they would have seen ample evidence of ruins and monuments and mounds and all sorts of things. Whereas we know that the Faroe Islands didn't have any Neolithic, Bronze Age or Iron Age settlement. So unless there's some misinterpretation or ridicule that has been tweaked in some form, it still seems that the Faroe Islands is the best explanation for that particular reference. The bit 14 has also been suggested as the Faroes, but that's not quite so clear. That could be Shetland, for all we know, because we don't know what they meant by Britain, the islands of Britain. Did that include Shetland? It's difficult to know. Okay, other evidence for these people being in the Faroe Islands, for example. Do we have any other forms of evidence? Well, we have this strange thing, this brown sheep in the case there in the museum in Tórshavn. Jeez, I forgot the name there. Tórshavn. This is the last of the old type of sheep that used to run about on Luitleduimun, the island above it there, until it was shot by the farmer in the 19th century who wanted to replace it with ewe sheep. Now this kind of sheep is a very small, dark sheep. I'm still waiting to hear about genetic test of it, but just on the look, it looks very similar to the soy sheep, which are also an isolated type of sheep which existed on the island of Soy on St Kilda. The soy sheep are regarded as the last remnants of Bronze Age sheep in Scotland, and just on the basis of one thing looking like the other, these Luitla green moon sheep look very like a soy sheep. So how did they get there? Mystery. Because they're not the type of sheep that the Vikings would have taken, as far as I can see. They differ from, say, the Faroese, the Shetland sheep, and the more sort of typical Norse sheep. And the reason I put Kyrene there is that there was a people. This is another mystery, one of these things we can't follow up. It's just put it in for fun. Ptolemy drew his map in about 150 AD, including the names of peoples who lived in what's now Scotland, and in the northwest he said there were a people called the Kyrene, and that's a Celtic name. It means the sheep people. Modern Gaelic word for a sheep is a cuirach. So were there people heading off into these sort of isolated places before the monks actually sticking sheep on them? Might seem a strange thing to do, but you could then go back and get them at a later date. Just one of these little things. It's to mention it's to connect, of course. It's to connect, of course, to the story of countless sheep, as Dichio mentions it. Actually, we're about to come to an end. That's sorry about that. I was hoping we could have a little debate. Have a look at the other evidence for the Faroe Islands. Faroe evidence has actually come up now. There is evidence for pre-Viking activity in the Faroe Islands at Sandoy, and so look that up. I'll put a link to that. So there we go. The Atlantic was Celtic before the Vikings started heading off, but we don't know to what extent, and we don't know how far they got. But they had the means, they had the technology, and they had the desire. So there's no